Good afternoon. Good afternoon again. My name is Gary McDowell, and with Terry Price, I'm the co-director of the John Marshall International Center for the Study of Statesmanship at the Jepson School here at the University of Richmond. And it's our pleasure to welcome you to what is our final academic lecture for the year, The Gospel According to the Apostle Ben by Professor Ralph Lerner of the University of Chicago. I would be remiss if I didn't make this a little more personal and more than our usual introductions. But I have to confess that this is a warning to all teachers. Be careful what you say, be careful what you do, because it might linger in the minds of some, and they'll do dangerous things with it later. It was in 1976 that I began graduate study at the University of Chicago, in no small part because Ralph Lerner was there. And it was my pleasure to sign up that first quarter for our Introduction to American Political Thought, Franklin and Paine. All these years later, I remembered it, he made an impression on me, and now we've dragged him to Richmond to talk about him again, and we thank him for that. I don't want to spend a lot of time reading Professor Lerner's invitation that you received. He's been at the university, with few exceptions of visits, all of his professional life. He has been a teacher of extraordinary gifts. He has been able to transform lives in his classroom, and I'll say simply that his classroom is a very special place. But his classroom is not the only place he teaches. He is a scholar of wide-ranging interests and publications. I just want to share with you four articles that he's written and where they were published over the course of his career. The first, Maimonides' Treatise on Resurrection, which appeared in the Journal of Religions. Second, Commerce and Character, the Anglo-American as New Model in the William and Mary Quarterly. Calhoun's New Science of Politics in the American Political Science Review. And the Supreme Court as Republican Schoolmaster in the Supreme Court Review. In his books, he's published such titles as The Thinking Revolutionary, Principle and Practice in the New Republic, Maimonides' Empire of Light, Popular Enlightenment in the Age of Belief, most recently, Playing the Fool, Subversive Laughter in Troubled Times. He's also the co-editor with the late Philip B. Kurland of the Founders' Constitution, a magnificent multi-volume set that gets at the root of what the Constitution is all about. For those of us with an interest in the bicentennial when that was taking place, this was considered to be the crown jewel of all the publications that came out during that celebratory period. It's a great honor to have Ralph Lerner with us today to speak to us about Benjamin Franklin, not least because he is the Benjamin Franklin Professor Emeritus at the University of Chicago. Professor Lerner.
Thank you, Gary, for your kind remarks. I hope I don't offend anyone's religious sensibilities. I'm only reporting. It's almost an article of faith among Western liberal people that close scrutiny of another individual's religious beliefs is a grave act of trespass. The very thought of such probing evokes in the imagination a long, dismal prospect, ending at last with the stake and the pyre. What could be more emphatically private, mine, than my thoughts? Keep out. Yet even those groups most insistent on claiming a sacred precinct for conscience reserve a right to police their own by setting the metes and bounds by which they define themselves. The claim of a common identity implies a correlative determination of who and what do not belong, hence of orthodoxy, heterodoxy, and schism, and, if need be, excommunication. The more intense our convictions, the more wary we are of whatever might corrupt or undermine them. None of this is especially paradoxical in a society grown increasingly secular. As long as the state respects freedom of association, the public at large can ignore the agitations of inquisitorial priests and mullahs. These may be disturbers of the peace, but it is a piece of a part. And where there are many such parts or sects, civil society can soldier on with little or no concern. Kind of James Madison argument. General indifference to what excites a relative few keeps the overall temperature of religious controversy within tolerable limits, yet without quite extinguishing a persistent curiosity about others' religious beliefs. This is markedly the case when we try to recover or reimagine the inner lives of persons of a special interest to us, those rare individuals whose achievements and singularities command attention through the generations. And when, among those individuals, there's to be found a record of spiritual searching, the invitation to look more closely into what is said, what is left unsaid, and what is implied becomes well-nigh irresistible. This is precisely the challenge that confronts anyone trying to reconstruct or unearth the religion of Benjamin Franklin. Serious-minded scholars have tried their hand at this, producing quite a few learned studies with predictably mixed results. Starting from different premises, more often assumed than argued, commentators have focused on different aspects of a public figure who lived long and wrote much. It is not only their conclusions that have differed. Even more disparate and conflicting have been their assessments of the mind they are trying to fathom from a great distance. The fact that the object of their scrutiny delighted in donning masks, playing jokes, and conveying his teachings both by explicit maxims and by indirection only further complicates the already challenging task of reading another's inner thoughts. The more earnest we may be about getting to the bottom of this wily fellow's mind, the more do we need to lighten up, detect a wink, and be ready to go along with a joke as far as it may take us. Alas, all too often, serious people find that hard to do. Ben understood this very well. He was an astute reader of men and made careful, deliberate use of that understanding, both to enlighten and to conceal, as best served his purposes and interests. Taking advantage of our human propensity to generalize on the basis of insufficient evidence, he engaged in wholesale manipulation. Appreciating our inordinate love for our long-held but largely unexamined opinions, he avoided frontal attacks in daytime in favor of mining and sapping under cover of darkness. All of which is to say that Ben is never more carefully to be watched than when he is charming, or wearing a zany mask, or sincere. This premise of mine is not without its own pitfalls. Predetermined wariness may tempt a reader to apply a large discount rate to everything our author has to say, to the point that a presumed irony dissolves an argument into incoherence. We dare not be flat-footed when trying to keep with someone as nimble as our man. At the same time, we ought not to dismiss a naive reading of a sophisticated text. Following an argument as it presents itself, and wherever it may lead, keeps us focused on the issue at hand. This mode of procedure may not bring us directly to the depths of a problem, but at least does not keep us from getting there. Okay, so what I'm going to offer is a naive reading. When examining Ben's literary output bearing on religious themes, one can hardly complain of a want of materials. From first to last, from the Silence Do-Good essays of 1722 to his last writings in 1790, he found occasion to touch on points of belief and practice that may have troubled him, or may have troubled others, or may have troubled him about the way others had laid their doubts to rest. Yet from the standpoint of ordinary believers, leaving enthusiasts aside, Ben's analyses and conclusions often appear thin, tepid, and disengaged. In other cases, when he argues with a special vigor, as in the 1725 pamphlet, A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain, His labors seem more a triumph of cleverness than of good sense. Nor is it easy to reconcile the many orthodox-sounding pronouncements with the outlandish news hoaxes, loony letters to the editor writing to himself, pretending to be someone else, and satires in which he embeds them. Ben's crazy house of mirrors can make us reach for the walls to steady ourselves and ward off vertigo. Where then to begin? And how far afield ought one to search? I propose to be guided by this reformulation of the problem. I promised you the problem. Okay. Ben presents himself in his memoir as a man with a message, in fact, many messages, to which he devotes much thought and energy in the hope of bettering himself, his immediate environs, and ultimately all of posterity. He has good news to share with mankind, but entertains few illusions about their readiness to hear and act on his gospel. Observing at first hand the successes and failures of contemporary evangelists, George Whitefield most prominently, he resolves to do them one better. Rather than rely on the emotive power of a living voice to rouse a multitude, he will use his own life as an example, and especially his judicious, carefully constructed, written representation of his example, the so-called autobiography, to reorient people's desires and expectations. Ben is no orator. Neither is he a nonstop prattler, but he is a winning conversationalist. He has mastered his overweening ambition and intelligence, at least to this extent, that he can appear in public like one of us, foibles, warts, and all, draping diffidence all over his more disturbing propositions. He would set his audience's thoughts in motion. Let each go as far as he can. Even the least of them will be the better for it, while those who see more deeply into his program can themselves become apostles in turn. In considering Ben as a man with messages, with a mission, indeed as a missionary, we both enlarge the range of relevant themes and free ourselves of the need to deal with each and every explicitly religious paper. Of a special interest ought to be I'm going to quote a lot. I mean, this is a superior writer, one of the finest writers of English prose. So rather than say quote and unquote all the time, I'll go like this. The little liturgy or form of prayer for my own private use that Ben composed in 1728, 22 years old. In his memoir, he points readers in that direction after expressing his disgust with the sermons of polemical preachers and after explaining, but emphatically not excusing, his non-attendance at public worship. Early on in his narrative, Ben signals his impatience with the 17th century Presbyterian piety that still suffused his childhood home in Boston. Once he was out from under his father's supervision, the young apprentice could retreat to the quiet of his brother's printing shop, Sunday being my studying day, and devote himself to the more urgent business of self-improvement. Ben confesses that as a young adolescent, I still thought church attendance a duty, though I could not, as it seemed to me, afford the time to practice it. Indeed, it's far from certain that Ben would have made it to the church door even had he lucked upon a preacher after his liking, one focused more on urging his congregants to be good citizens rather than simply Orthodox members of the sect. even after sacrificing 5 Sundays successively to listening to a Presbyterian who failed his test, the most Ben allows is this, quote, had he been, in my opinion underlined by him, a good preacher, perhaps I might have continued, notwithstanding the occasion I had for the Sunday's leisure in my course of study. You'd better not stand there waiting for him to appear in his Sunday best. In light of all this, we may turn to Ben's private liturgy, his articles of belief and acts of religion, with expectations that it will be stripped down, generic, and focused on rendering its reader useful to himself and others. That it does so is no surprise, but how it goes about that task is another matter. Mixed signals appear from the outset. In almost anything you read of Franklin, this is an aside, mixed signals are all over the text, but you have to have your antennae out to catch them. A quatrain from a famous play by Joseph Addison, Cato, A Tragedy, sets the tone of what is to follow. This is what heads the Articles of Belief. Quote, here will I hold, if there is a power above us, and that there is, all nature cries aloud through all her works, he must delight in virtue, and that which he delights in must be happy. That's the quote from Addison. All's well with a world in which a loving God delights in virtue. Yes, we mortals have our work cut out for us, but we can approach it with a spring in our step. Yet, oddly enough, these lines are taken from a soliloquy in which the tragic hero, Cato, is contemplating suicide, oppressed as he is by the sense that this world is made not for the likes of him, but of Caesar. One might take this semi-concealed incongruity to reflect Ben's own inner struggles, and scholars have done that. Or one might doubt that Ben shared the Romans' severe notion of virtue, and thus could more readily accept the shadows, clouds, and darkness that rest. All in all, Ben's liturgy lifts spirits and encourages belief that we can achieve and deserve the fruits of virtue, however understood, if only we put our minds to it. The prospect of human happiness is not a cosmic joke. No. You have a slanty thing that won't take a cup with water. Only the first part of this liturgy has survived. It begins with a statement of first principles, which turn out to be a collection of beliefs and imaginings. Ben posits, quote, one supreme, most perfect being, author and father of the gods themselves, end quote. We have a problem right there. The multiplicity of lesser created gods seems to be required by Ben's inability to imagine man, or this earth, or even our entire solar system, to be worthy of the attention, let alone the solicitude, of the supremely perfect. However much he stretches his imagination, he cannot picture the infinite Father as other than utterly removed and utterly unconcerned with anything as inconsequential as man. So far from expecting or requiring worship or praise from us, this incomprehensible power is, quote, even infinitely above it, printed in small caps. Notwithstanding the seemingly unbridgeable chasm, quote, there is in all men something like a natural principle which inclines them to devotion or the worship of some unseen power, unquote. And given that our species is superior in rationality to all other animals in our world, and these are Franklin's words now, therefore I think it seems required of me and my duty as a man to pay divine regards to something. Something is in all caps. It's hard to do justice to this seeming syllogism. Is it by virtue of our rational faculty that this seeming, this imagining, sets us in search of a something to which we can offer praise and adoration? Is it intolerable to think that we are alone and on our own, bereft of any connection to anything greater than ourselves? Ben doesn't say. Instead, he offers a series of paragraphs beginning, quote, I conceive, in which he literally conceives a polytheistic universe of lesser gods, creatures of the unreachable infinite, each of whom in turn creates his own solar system. Now, at last, there hovers into view our kind of God, wise, good, and approachable. Whether this local God of ours is immortal or subject to decay and replacement by others seems not to matter. It is enough that, quote, I conceive that he has some of the passions he has planted in us, unquote. Thus, this God is not above caring for us and is open to being pleased by our praise and offended by our slights or neglect. Hence, too, it is no indignity toward him that I should conceive having such a being for, quote, my friend, and even believe he takes pleasure and delight in his creature's happiness. I firmly believe he delights to see me virtuous because he is pleased when he sees me happy. What a relief. But on what grounds can we view of our local God? In his earlier radical pamphlet, A Dissertation on Liberty and Necessity, Pleasure and Pain, Ben had deduced harsh, disturbing conclusions for man based on two generally accepted propositions. First, quote, there is said to be a first mover who is called God, maker of the universe. And second, quote, he is said to be all wise, all good, all powerful. Such a God holds everything in his hands, leaving no room for chance, free will, or for that matter, prayer. The design of that universe is beyond our merely human comprehension. And hence all our judgments of good and evil and of virtue and vice are myopic and senseless. We can't put ourselves in the divine position and look down and understand what's going on. Our only comfort lies in the belief that the design of this great machine, the universe, is an expression of the presumed attributes of its divine artificer. 3 years later, in his Articles of Belief, Ben works the other side of the street. Thanks to the intercessions of those lesser beings or gods made by the infinite for reasons known to himself, or more accurately, thanks to that particular wise and good God who is the author and owner of our solar system, we enjoy the many things he has created, which seem purely designed for the delight of man. This local God is no killjoy, and Ben is mightily moved to love and adore unfailingly and continually a God whose message seems to be happy and you will be good. Indeed, the body language that Ben recommends to himself prior to entering into his liturgies, prayers of adoration, petition, and thanksgiving is worlds away from the fears, weeping, contrition, and even self-flagellation of others seeking to address the Almighty. Quote, I ought to use a countenance that expresses a filial respect mixed with a kind of smiling that signifies inward joy and satisfaction and admiration. It's no small relief to believe that one is addressing a father who is, quote, pleased with the pleasure of his children. In keeping with the sense of closeness to a God who seems almost predisposed in our favor, the local God, of course, Ben's petition deals only in passing with the temporal blessings he might hope for. Rather than presume to ask for these, he desires divine assistance in living a life that would merit such rewards. He sets himself apart from those men who commonly petition the deity for many things without any certain knowledge that the objects of their wishes would prove, quote, real goods if they were in our possession. Ben understands that we mortals are invincibly ignorant in this crucial respect. Thus, he declines to prescribe what his Father ought to give him by way of rewards and bounties. This humble petitioner asks instead, and most of all, for help in avoiding certain actions and in abhorring certain patterns of behavior. Quote, which kind of supplications will at least be thus far beneficial, as they should remind me in a solemn manner of my extensive duty. Judging from the catalog of vices to be eschewed, Ben's, quote, continual endeavors and resolutions would be unceasing. I have to give you some details, because this is precious. This is what he prays that God will help him avoid. Vices that Ben petitions his heavenly Father to be preserved from: atheism, infidelity, impiety, profaneness. That he avoid irreverence, ostentation, formality, odious hypocrisy, pride, disrespect, contumacy, cruelty, harshness, oppression, insolence, unreasonable severity, avarice, ambition, intemperance, luxury, lasciviousness. That he abhor treason, tyranny, extortion, perjury, every kind of wickedness. That he refrain from calumny, detraction. That he avoid and abhor deceit, envy, fraud, flattery, hatred, malice, lying, ingratitude. That he be watchful against pride, anger, that momentary madness. That he be averse to craft, overreaching. Quote, and forasmuch as ingratitude is one of the most odious of vices, let me not be unmindful gratefully to acknowledge the favors I receive from heaven. Barring a miraculous transformation of this 22-year-old, some other auxiliary support has to be enlisted. It was about this time, Ben recalls, that I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. The memoir's account of that great and extensive project is detailed enough to allow us to recapture the thinking that undergirds it. To be sure, those few pages are not the book that he promised to write under the title The Art of Virtue. Pressed by the competing commitments of a very busy life, Ben settles for offering a summary or prospectus of that never-to-be-written work. Even so, its inclusion in his life story signals an expectation that those dozen or so pages might suffice as they stand to inspire and instruct any young person intent on taking charge of his own moral development. You have to remember, this is a young man without a family who is basically responsible for taking care of himself. And he has a certain character that he has in view of reaching or attaining. And how do you get from where I am to where I would like to be? Nor is that all. Certain features of what Ben characterizes as an art cannot escape notice. Foremost among these is the stress upon method as the means of arriving at or drawing nearer to the goal of moral perfection. His is still not another of those tedious, ineffectual sermons conjuring you to be good, but rather a practical exhibition of how to do better. You can do it. Equally prominent is the pride shown by the inventor in promoting this method for others to adopt and follow. And especially noteworthy is the creed around which might be formed first a small clandestine sect, his word, to be called the Society of the Free and Easy, and ultimately a united party for virtue composed of good and wise men of all nations. Stripped down to its basic propositions, Ben's doctrine to be preached is designed to offend none by encapsulating what he takes to be the essentials of every known religion, and thereby enlisting virtuous men everywhere to, quote, league together to strengthen the interest of virtue in the world. It's striking that this elaborate program of self-help presupposes that, quote, men's minds do not die with their bodies, but are made more happy or miserable after this life according to their actions. In short, this one God, Father of the universe, cares and extends his providence to those of his creatures who love and do good to their fellow men. A pious person might recast this thought differently, that divine providence attaches to those who exercise human providence. But that would obscure or mistake the grounds on which Ben rests his case for providence. I'm going to turn to that now. Fortunately, those grounds are still available to us, thanks to Ben's having inscribed in his commonplace book a draft of a talk he gave on this subject to his intimate pot companions, buddies, in the self-improvement and mutual aid society he had formed called the Junto. Ben begins his remarks, and the paper has this title, On the Providence of God in the Government of the World. He begins his remarks with a confession of rashness and an appeal for his listeners' indulgence. He lacks the qualification for speaking to this matter, and his audience, who know him too well, can have no presumptions in his favor. All he can hope for is that they will treat his argument as an acquaintance's private opinion, with which they are free to approve or disapprove as they please. He humbly asks for their patience and attention. Being men of substantial reason, they would not be taken in by flourishes of rhetoric, nor will Ben, who is, quote, no master of that deceitful science, unquote, presume to offer anything other than the plain, unadorned reasoning. Unquote, unsupported by the authority of any books or men, how sacred soever. His argument has to stand on its own 2 feet. Neither speaker nor audience would have it otherwise. Yet the argument's point of departure is indeed an appeal to authority. Quote, it might be adjudged an affront to your understandings should I go about to prove this first principle, the existence of a deity, and that he is the creator of the universe. For that would suppose you ignorant of what all mankind in all ages have agreed in. Here, I have to ask, have Ben's discerning pals already dropped their guard so as to mistake a consensus gentium for a self-evident truth? Will they re-examine their casual acceptance of the foundation of this principle when they learn a few pages later in his talk that some evildoers even blaspheme him, their creator, in the most horrible manner? A minority, to be sure, but hardly the unanimity asserted at the beginning. Ben compliments his fellow members of the Janto for their wariness. Quote, "Ye believe a thing to be no more true for being sung than said," unquote. One wonders, however, whether their wariness extends as far as that expressed by Ben when writing under the pen name Veridicus a few years later. Quote, "Prevailing opinions insensibly gain the possession of our minds and have commonly the advantage of being first-comers, and yet are very often no better than prevailing falsehoods, directly the reverse of truth. A man can hardly forbear wishing those things to be true and right, which he apprehends would be for his conveniency to find so. And many persuasions, when they are looked into, plainly appear to have no better a foundation." That was in print. But Ben does not tarry. He proceeds to observe 3 attributes of this deity which will shape his entire analysis of the possibility of providence. And of course, when I speak of providence here, I mean particular providence. 1, that he must be a being of great wisdom. 2, that he must be a being of great goodness. And 3, that he must be a being of great power. The evidentiary basis for these propositions is developed with economy and care, even as Ben, in the retelling, elevates his God's wisdom and power almost immediately from great to infinite. The proof of infinite wisdom consists in the admirable order and disposition of the visible universe. Ben goes further than the psalmist, David, whom he of course does not quote. It is not only the heavens that declare the glory of God. Look closely, consider attentively and thoroughly the large and the small, and you must, quote, be astonished and swallowed up in admiration. The fitness of it all is such that the highest and most exquisite human reason cannot find a fault and say, this would have been better so, or in another manner, unquote. Human reason sets the criterion and gives the ultimate compliment to God. We couldn't have done it better. The proof of great goodness appears, first of all, in the gift of life itself. If it weren't a benefit, why would creatures be so unwilling to leave it? Further, this deity exhibits his goodness in supplying plentiful sustenance for all his creatures, not least of all the vegetables, metals, and animals useful to men. Considered seriously and carefully, this beneficence would fill us with the highest love and affection. Yet this goodness is not at first said to be infinite, perhaps in recognition of what Ben has suppressed, namely, that the gift of life is inexorably connected with mortality, and that our enjoyment of corn, iron, horses, oxen, and sheep is mitigated by our having to contend with pests, disease, and human toil. The proof of infinite power appears most clearly in the vast matter and prodigious motions of a planetary system that doesn't self-destruct. Consider this from the standpoint of, quote, weak and foolish creatures as we are. Despite our knowing the nature of only a few things, we are able to produce such wonderful effects. We can make liquids that dissolve the hardest iron, or render the most solid bodies fluid. Knowing the nature of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, quote, those mean ingredients mixed, we can shake the air in the most terrible manner, destroy ships, houses, and men at a distance, and in an instant, overthrow cities, rend rocks into 1,000 pieces, and level the highest mountains, end of quote. If we finite men can do all this with gunpowder, imagine the power of one who knows the nature of everything and can even make things of new natures. Given then that the world was made by a being of such wisdom, goodness, and power, how might we conceive of his governance of this world? 4 possibilities present themselves. I think it's an exhaustive classification here. One is that everything in nature is predetermined. Second is that everything is left to general nature and the free agency of his creatures. Third is that some things are decreed while others are left to the workings of general nature and free agency. And fourth is that this being we call God, quote, sometimes interferes by his particular providence and sets aside the effects which would otherwise have been produced by any of the above causes, end quote. The arguments Ben raises in order to dismiss the first 3 suppositions are all premised on a tacit rejection of Isaiah 55:8. Not that he quotes it, of course, but I'll quote it. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. On the contrary, Ben labors to show that the first 3 suppositions ought to be rejected out of hand precisely because they are inconsistent with the common light of reason, and that the fourth is the most agreeable to it and therefore most probably true. Under the first supposition, a God who unchangeably decreed everything at the beginning would have nothing left to do. Quote, he has tied up his hands and has now no greater power than an idol of wood or stone. There would be no reason for us to pray to him or worship him. Even worse, all the manifest evil in the world would be attributable to a being posited as wise and good, a being who ordained prayer, which is guaranteed to be both futile for improving men's condition and useless to him. Absurd. Under the second supposition, God must either make so glorious a universe merely to abandon it, and what sense does that make? Or else turn into an indifferent observer who leaves men to their devices with such outcomes as chance would have it. To the pleas of the just, the innocent, the beneficent, and the good, as they cry to him, standing at the brink of destruction, he can only say in effect, quote, I cannot help you, 'tis none of my business, nor do I at all regard these things. Are we to believe that all the glorious attributes of this God are to lie dormant and useless? That's out. The third supposition is no less unacceptable. To assert that the deity has decreed some things, but otherwise refrains from altering or interrupting the workings of nature and free agency, is no better than the preceding. Quote, still you ungod him. He has nothing to do. This absurdity, quote, cannot be swallowed without doing the greatest violence to common reason. By that criterion of judgment, our human understanding, we are necessarily driven into accepting the fourth supposition, which has this too going for it, that it perfectly conforms to what we can know of God's attributes and perfections. The adroitness with which Ben has transformed a generally accepted belief into an unquestionable standard may be admired, but has to give us pause. The only objection to his neat reasoning that Ben feels obliged to consider before concluding his talk is a possible misgiving some might have to the proposition that men are indeed at least partially free agents. He offers one short argument. If an infinitely powerful, wise, and good God has seen fit to communicate to us a part of his wisdom, power, and goodness, why might he not also have communicated some part of his freedom as well? Quote, is not even his infinite power sufficient for this? It is enough for Ben to show that it is not impossible. He thinks no man can show that it is improbable. And he leaves it at suggesting that he might possibly demonstrate clearly on some other occasion, not now, that men are in some degree free agents and hence accountable for their actions. At bottom, however, the case for occasional interventions and displays of particular providence rests on the unacceptability of the alternatives. Are the sufferings of an oppressed, righteous nation to go unanswered because God cannot? Didn't you grant his infinite power? Or because he will not? Didn't you grant his infinite goodness? To escape from such absurdities, you're obliged to allow that it is highly reasonable to believe in the providence of a deity who observes and cares and rewards us. It is this belief, Ben concludes, that is the foundation of all true religion. And this religion, in turn, will be, these are his words, a powerful regulator of our actions. Give us peace and tranquility within our own minds and render us benevolent, useful, and beneficial to others. End of quote. By virtue of our loving, revering, thanking, adoring, fearing, and praying to that deity, we move closer to the same goals Ben had in his sights when first conceiving his bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. As it turns out, the method of the art of virtue and the liturgy of the articles of beliefs of religion are two sides of the same coin. Reaching out to his audience, this adroit evangelist enlists alternative modes and masks in pursuit of his single-minded mission. I have more. It is inviting to carry this observation even further. Might not the same be said of that writing of Ben's, which has been most reprinted, most translated, and most responsible for others holding him in both respect and derision? Consider the images of Benjamin Franklin that have endured in the popular mind for the past 2 centuries. First, there is that 46-year-old man flying a kite with a key attached in the middle of a thunderstorm. An example to be shunned by anyone hoping to live long. Second, there's the author, promoter of the advice in Father Abraham's speech. An example to be recommended to anyone hoping to live free. In the first case, we cannot know whether providence or just plain good luck preserved Ben from being electrocuted on the spot. In the second case, the ambiguities are of a different character. Father Abraham's speech is emphatically the production of a man with a message, and even presents itself as a sermon addressed to a congregation of sorts. That message is a plea for human providence. It states and restates with studied tedium the means within the grasp of any ordinary human being to gain some control over his own life and to bend circumstances to his earthly advantage. Needless to say, coming from Ben's hand, that account is not without its ironies and mixed signals. Viewed in isolation, the substance of the sermon is a potpourri of folk sayings, drawn from the pages of Poor Richard's almanac of the previous 25 years. Its boring repetitiveness calls to mind the reasons Ben offered for absenting himself from church as soon as he could. In its reported effects, the sermon is a total failure. And yet this comical fiasco is treated by Richard Saunders, that's the Poor Richard, the idiosyncratic purported author and editor of the almanac, as a flattering endorsement of his wit and wisdom. Once again, the song sung by our evangelist has more than one register. This thing, Father Abraham's speech, appeared as the preface to the Poor Richard Improved, the almanac of 1758, and it's Ben's swan song, so to speak. The swan song to the enterprise that has brought him a fame and fortune. He composes it at sea while on his way to London, where the challenges, frustrations, and achievements of a new diplomatic career await him. However much the thoughts of the newly appointed colonial agent may have run ahead, his mode of composition here reflects his earliest efforts and ambition to become a tolerable English writer. Like so many of his literary creations, this preface aims to simultaneously inform, persuade, and entertain. In his memoir, Ben makes no secret of his didactic intent in publishing the almanac. I have an extended quote here. I considered it as a proper vehicle for conveying instruction among the common people, who bought scarce any other books. I therefore filled all the little spaces that occurred between the remarkable days in the calendar with proverbial sentences, chiefly such as inculcated industry and frugality as the means of procuring wealth, and thereby securing virtue. It being more difficult for a man in want to act always honestly, as, to use here one of those proverbs, it is hard for an empty sack to stand upright. These proverbs, which contain the wisdom of many ages and nations, I assembled and formed into a connected discourse, prefixed to the Almanac of 1757, as the harangue of a wise old man to the people attending an auction. The bringing all these scattered counsels thus into a focus enabled them to make greater impression. Impress it does, but unfortunately in different ways. For the multitude of reprintings and translations that spread Father Abraham's harangue wide and far, where I got a figure somewhere here. It was reprinted at least 145 times in 7 different languages before the end of the 18th century, and countless times thereafter, and it's still available. I didn't look up the number on Amazon.com. Those reprintings and translations usually strip the speech from the 2 contexts in which Ben embeds it. What remain are the flat-footed, deadly, earnest injunctions to pinch pennies and keep your nose to the grindstone. The kind of counsels that drove Ernest Renan and Max Weber and D.H. Lawrence and many others to distraction. A charitable excuse for their failing to catch on to what Ben is about would be that they had an incomplete and hence imperfect text before them. At any rate, they were not in the least amused. I hope you will be before I'm through this afternoon. In his final address to his courteous reader, the author of Poor Richard Improved, Richard Saunders, astronomer, astrologer, prognosticator, philomath, microscopist, and more, begins with a public confession of his private chagrin. Like any author, he would like to have the pleasure of hearing himself quoted respectfully by other learned authors, but only seldom has he been gratified in this regard. For though he has been, quote, if I may say it without vanity, an eminent author of almanacs, unquote, for a full quarter century, the world of letters seems not to know him at all. But for the solid pudding, meaning the cash, his publication has earned, he would have been quite discouraged by this great deficiency of praise. Poor Richard finds solace at last, not from his brother authors who sit on their hands, but from the people at large who buy his works and show thereby that they are the best judges of his merit. Better yet, he discovers on his rambles, where he's not personally known, that his maxims are frequently quoted. Quote, with, as Poor Richard says on the end of it, this gave me some satisfaction, as it showed not only that my instructions were regarded, but discovered likewise some respect for my authority. And I own that to encourage the practice of remembering and repeating those wise sentences, I've sometimes quoted myself with great gravity. What price respect? What price authority? To gratify his vanity, this eminent author, if he must say so himself, and he does, is reduced to priming the pump of respect. Poor Richard. Happily, things look up one day for Richard when he comes upon a great gathering of people at a public auction of merchant goods. The scene that he depicts is like these scenes at 4 or 5 a.m. the day after Thanksgiving. While the crowd waits for the appointed hour of sale, they grouse to one another about the badness of the times. Spotting a plain, clean old man with white locks, someone calls out, "Pray, Father Abraham, what think you of the times? Won't these heavy taxes quite ruin the country? How shall we ever be able to pay them? What would you advise us to?" Some questions and some grousing never change. Okay. The old man is willing to oblige and speak his mind. Quote, "I'll give it you in short, for a word to the wise is enough, and many words won't fill a bushel," as Poor Richard says. What follows is a harangue of almost 3,000 words, containing a barrage of some 50, as Poor Richard says, attributions. Who could ask for more? Who would ask for more? In judging the character of Father Abraham's speech, one ought not to forget Ben's own statement of intent. He's not offering an anthology or a representative sample of those many hundreds of proverbs on man, marriage, and society that he has tucked into the blank spaces in the almanac. His principle of inclusion is determined by a theme, and the arrangement of the selected proverbs is to bring those scattered counsels into a focus. Richard Saunders' valedictory preface appears to be offering a recapitulation, but Ben is in fact redefining what he wants people to take away from those 25 years of reading. It's no misnomer that the multitude of reprintings of Father Abraham's speech called it the way to wealth. Yeah, I think if you look it up on Amazon, Don't look up Father Abraham's speech. I don't know what that will get you. But the way to wealth. But to the extent that the speech was printed or read without regard to the two frames that surround it, Richard reporting the speech and its reception, and behind him, of course, Ben, orchestrating and manipulating the responses of the entire ensemble, Abraham, the crowd, Richard, and the reader himself. It's hazardous to draw quick and easy conclusions about Ben's own stance. All of this is to suggest that in examining this paean to industry, prudence, and frugality, we proceed with caution. There's more to discover about this apostle's gospel if only we try. Father Abraham is ready enough to accede to the crowd's call for advice. But what he delivers is hardly a model of gentle, ingratiating speech, such as the original Father Abraham followed. The brunt of his message is that his audience's grousing is misdirected. Their discontents and distress are less of the government's making than of their own. Quote, "We are taxed twice as much by our idleness, 3 times as much by our pride, and 4 times as much by our folly. And from these taxes, the commissioners cannot ease or deliver us by allowing an abatement." End of quote. The people's blindness to the real costs of their sloth leaves them resentful and ineffectual. Quote, "So what signifies wishing and hoping for better times? We may make these times better if we bestir ourselves. Industry need not wish," as poor Richard says, "and he that lives upon hope will die fasting." Industry, however, does not suffice for an individual to escape his depressed and dependent condition. He must also make it his business to attend closely to his own affairs. Quote, "Trusting too much to others' care is the ruin of many. For as the Almanac says, in the affairs of the world, men are saved not by faith, but by the want of it." Even so, Father Abraham's admonitions are not yet finished. Finally, and most expansively, he dwells on the need for frugality. This is where D.H. Lawrence and Max Weber, go into orbit. This is a hard case to make to a crowd straining for the sale to start. But the old man, like his biblical namesake, is not one to shrink from uttering unseasonable thoughts. Quote, "A man may, if he knows not how to save as he gets, keep his nose all his life to the grindstone and die not worth a groat at last." Pride, vanity, susceptibility to seeming bargains and offers of free credit. It's your Daily Mail. Yeah? All work to seduce the heedless into lives of debt, anxiety, and dependency. At bottom, Father Abraham's sermon is a call for ordinary people to recognize their real situation, rather than complain about conditions beyond their control. They ought to address the many ways in which their own fecklessness leads them into poverty and keeps them there. What is worse, quote, "Poverty often deprives a man of all spirit and virtue." Remember that empty sack? The way to wealth is not, I repeat, not a celebration of wealth or of money grubbing, still less a rehabilitation of avarice. If it focuses so narrowly on the prosaic needs and economic behavior of man, that is because they are indispensable means, the material preconditions, so to speak, for a human being to be able to act in his own true interest. By the end of his harangue, the old man pleads with his congregation to disdain the chain of debt and thereby, quote, preserve your freedom and maintain your independency. Only then are you in a position to shape and cherish a decent character of your own. Before concluding his remarks and descending from his pulpit, Father Abraham fires off 2 warning shots at the crowd. Each appears strangely at odds with this long paean to self-sufficiency. Coming at the end, these misgivings cast a long shadow over much of what has been so confidently asserted throughout the speech. Quote, this doctrine, my friends, is reason and wisdom. But after all, do not depend too much on your own industry and frugality and prudence, though excellent things, for they may all be blasted without the blessing of heaven. And therefore ask that blessing humbly. And be not uncharitable to those at present seem to want it, but comfort and help them. Poor Richard may have been correct in asserting in 1733 and reasserting here in 1758 that God helps those who help themselves. But Father Abraham urges that you not get too confident about your ability or the deity's timely assistance. Humility and charity, however understood, make a surprising cameo appearance in a performance that gives little evidence of having missed them. Finally, and this is indeed the old man's parting shot, a profound doubt is raised about this whole effort to speak sense to the people. Quote, experience keeps a dear school, but fools will learn in no other, and scarce in that. For it is true we may give advice, but we cannot give conduct, as poor Richard says. However, remember this, they that won't be counseled can't be helped, as poor Richard says. And farther, if you will not hear reason, she'll surely rap your knuckles. Here's a severe judgment indeed, not only of the many fools who can barely learn their ABCs in the school of hard knocks, but of the earnest purveyors of good advice themselves, Father Abraham, poor Richard Saunders, and that wholesaler of endless proverbs, Ben. Are they also lacking in self-awareness that they don't realize how futile their efforts are bound to be? What transpires next in this narrative makes it abundantly clear that the answer to that question has to be ambiguous. Richard reports that the people heard the harangue, quote, approved the doctrine and immediately practiced the contrary, just as if it had been a common sermon. No sooner did the market open for business, but the congregation took off on a spending spree. For all their patient attendance, they had learned nothing. Lacking both a will and a method to take charge of their lives, they were sure to persist in the same cycle of servitude and dependency. The question recurs. Given the manifest failure of this exercise in popular enlightenment, ought we to pity or mock those who would gladly teach? As far as Father Abraham is concerned, we need to recall that he did not volunteer his advice or impose it on an unwilling audience. He was merely obliging a general request. Yet, given his rules for conducting one's life, we have to wonder what he was doing. What he was doing among all those doorbusters in the first place. What about the observer and narrator of this ridiculous scene? The eminent author, Richard Saunders. He's, of course, as pleased as Punch at hearing him echoed so long and so well. Quote, the frequent mention the old man made of me must have tired anyone else, but my vanity was wonderfully delighted with it. Though I was conscious that not a 10th part of the wisdom was my own, which he ascribed to me, but rather the gleanings I had made of the sense of all ages and nations. Only a master's hand, I think, could have crafted so humble a display of vanity. In the very act of puffing himself up with pride, poor Dick deflates and then explodes the whole charade. It turns out that it was not mere happenstance that he came upon the scene, as we had been prompted to surmise from the opening words of his story. Quote, "I stopped my horse lately where a great number of people were collected at a venue of merchant goods," unquote. At the very end, Richard lets the cat out of the bag. He'd come to shop. But happily, fortunately, providentially, just hearing his own gleanings rehearsed saved him in the nick of time. Quote, "Though I had at first determined to buy stuff for a new coat, I went away resolved to wear my old one a little longer," unquote. And lest you fail to draw the moral, Richard, ever the beneficent educator, draws it for you. "Reader, if thou wilt do the same, thy profit will be as great as mine." Conclusion. Now, after a quarter century contending with competitors and his wife Bridget, Richard Saunders has surely earned a place with Silence Dogood and Polly Baker among the finest productions of Ben's comic genius. Savoring his sense and nonsense might incline us to come to think of poor Richard as simply his creator's alter ego. But that temptation ought to be resisted. By conflating the two, we risk losing our way in the singularly tangled forest that is the inner life of Benjamin Franklin. Granted, the challenge of entering therein is great, given that what poor Richard once said of himself applies all the more to Ben. Quote, "I have good reasons for concealing the place of my abode," unquote. Nonetheless, we need to be wary of missing the forest for the trees. A man who concocts so many masks behind which to speak must indeed have good reasons. But about his largest message, at least, Ben is open and above board. He does not conceal his dedication to clarity of thinking. In a world in which wishes pass for facts, he offers sober counsel and witty encouragement so that each of us might come both to see better and do better. He would help one and all to disentangle themselves from snares and traps, largely of their own making or neglect. At the same time, he has no illusions that the bulk of mankind can perform the kind of auto-emancipation that he managed to accomplish while still an adolescent, albeit not without committing a few errata. People need support, and he's careful not to openly disparage or mock the many ways in which they seek and find that support. He cares little for small-minded clergy haranguing their congregations on matters of doctrine, while neglecting to help their flock actually lead moral and useful lives. He has similar disdain for village atheists who have nothing better to offer than mockery and disillusionment. Ben's special gospel is directed toward gaining self-respect and deserving it. No power, human or divine, can give that to you. It is yours to earn. And the best way to begin is to start a program of methodical self-improvement. Keep at it and gradually expand your power to do good as widely as you can. This single-minded objective informs his private liturgy, his special conception of providence, his formation of the junto, his program for moral perfection in the art of virtue, and his many public-spirited proposals bearing on the social, economic, and political issues of his day. The artful design of the story he wrote about his life and the zaniness, the sheer zaniness of many of the characters who populate his writings are all meant to further that objective. If Ben drew on a wide variety of modes and devices in all these cases, it was to better reach and motivate a wide variety of human types. And lest some straight-laced characters be put off by what they take to be his earthy unseemliness, and he has more than a few such moments, he warns them, quote, "Be thou not disturbed, O grave and sober reader, if among the many serious sentences in my book thou findest me trifling now and then and talking idly. Never fear, this wily apostle knows what he's doing." Thank you. Can we have questions?
Let's do a couple questions.
Let's have some questions, sure. Yes, sir.
Your paper convinces me more than ever that he was what today people call a secular humanist. That is, even his, you've implied that even the one miracle that he does believe in, the existence of God, is sort of a human need, like the need for food and water. Why do you think he was so different? You got all these letters from his sister and writings of his brother. Was he different from them, for instance?
Oh, yes.
And for instance, did they believe in miracles? And why didn't he?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not in the business of reading the hearts, what is it? The hearts and reins of man. Okay, only the Lord can do that. Okay, but his sister came from the same background, which is to say, pious Presbyterians who had emigrated to America from England, not just for what?
Calvinists?
Yes, but dissenters from the Church of England, to be sure, and in large measure for religious freedom, not wanting to hide, their version of Calvinism. I mean, Ben is another sort of, he never tells you, and it has to dawn on you at some point as you read his so-called autobiography and these other things. He's a genius. That's an enormous advantage in life. All the rest of us can only envy. Okay, he's a genius. And he has this kind of analytical mind, which doesn't mean that he doesn't goof and make stupid mistakes and so on, and some of them of a very serious sort, even though he sort of diminishes that in his retelling. But he's a free spirit by age 15. Okay. So, no, he's an outlier then. Of course, when he goes to England, he meets a lot of these people. David Hume, Adam Smith, et cetera, and they see him as a kindred soul. But in Boston, well, Boston goes without saying, even Philadelphia, where there's relative latitude and toleration and so on, he has to learn how to keep his mouth shut. But it's a long and hard process till he learns that.
No clue about why he was different.
Why he was, you mean, does he have some special gene or something?
Why not his brother?
Okay. Well, first of all, we don't know. The genes are a lottery in many respects. But he also works at it. He's enormously assiduous in following through on a program. And he tries to get you and you and you to do that too, assuming that if I can do it, so can you. But we discover in real life it's not that easy.
He's in a world where people are asking for substantial replies, and what you present him as doing is telling them a method.
Yes.
In other words, he simply evades the question they're asking in order to answer his own question.
But they may not be asking the right question. Okay. So the idea is to shift the focus of attention from what someone can do for you be it the Almighty or your patron or whatever, to the necessarily small beginning, those first steps toward freeing yourself from dependency. Now, we have millions of people in this country who thought nothing of buying houses worth multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars on the basis of no income at all. Okay, now, I mean, you could say at one level that's a no-brainer, yeah? But, you know, don't cry about the fates. Begin with what you can do.
Did he take any notice of the Lisbon earthquake that so agitated?
I haven't read anything on it that does, but he knows that bad things happen in the world, not the least of which are wars. I mean, he was convinced of the futility, stupidity of the whole war for independence. That's say the behavior and indifference and pride of the ministry in Whitehall that occasioned it, the spirit of revenge and resentment that overtook the Americans, and so forth and so on. It's not a world filled with heroes as far as he's concerned. Should we some more questions?
Let's do one more.
I thought I saw a hand. Did it all seem so incredible that you're silenced? Okay, well, I'm not in the business of dragooning you. Okay, so thank you for your attention.
I'm Terry Price, co-director of the Marshall Center with Gary McDowell. I want to thank you very much for coming out today and for supporting us throughout the year. Our grant from the Thomas Smith Foundation was renewed, and we're very, very happy about that. So there will be another series next year, and the year after, and the year after, and we hope to see you again next year. Let's thank Professor Lerner again, please.